Hey there, thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Alan Hernandez, broker and realtor for Picket Realty, sitting here with
Houston divorce attorney Robert Von Dohlen.
We're here because we want to talk to you about your options when it comes to selling your property in divorce. While it's not the best or easiest subject to talk about, our purpose and intention for today's webinar is to give you all of the information that you need to make an informed and well-educated decision. With that said, let's jump right in. Robert, when I looked up high-performing divorce attorneys and your name came up, it was easy to see that you were one of the people that are out there providing the results that people need when it comes to helping them with divorce. But I think that when people are going through divorce, the biggest things that happen is tons of questions that people don't generally know the right answers to. So in today's webinar, we're going to answer those questions for them. And I know that we can't get into specific scenarios, but for those of the people that stay all the way to the end, we're going to give you guys a copy of our most recent book, The Best-Selling Options to Sell in a Divorce, as well as Robert and I's contact information for the ability to be able to reach out to us and talk about your specific case if you find it necessary. How does that sound?
Sounds great, and he's right. We can't get into the nuts and bolts of everybody's specific situation, but I think we can provide some pretty good generic information here that you'll find helpful.
So I can tell you that when people come to me to sell their house, usually they have a handful of questions, and I jotted those down, and I'm going to go through them real quick so people know what to expect as we go through this conversation. Normally when people come to me, they say, can I be forced to sell my house in a divorce? Who gets to keep the house in a divorce? Can I move out of my house? Is my partner entitled to half of my house? Does my husband or wife have to pay the bills until we are in divorce? Did my spouse abandon me by leaving the house? How long does a divorce take in Texas? And those are just a few of the questions that I normally get when I meet with folks that are in the process of thinking about selling. Of course, the final question being, is it better to sell a house before or after a divorce? So let's jump right in. Where do you think, when it comes to being forced, that the law falls in? What is your recommendation when people come to you and say, can I be forced to sell my house in a divorce in Texas?
All right, well, so property in Texas in the divorce scenario is owned either separately or as a community. So separate property would be if you came into the marriage and you already owned this house. There's a few other ways to get to separate property, but that's a pretty easy one we can all understand. You've had this house for 10 years and then you meet your lovely spouse and you get married and then it didn't go so well, now you're divorcing. Well, that house was yours before, so that's your separate property. The other scenario is if it's community property. So, you get married and then you go buy a house, and so now you're divorcing and we've got this house to divest or get rid of. A divorce court cannot take anybody's separate property from them. It's possible that the court could order certain uses of the house during the pendency of the divorce, but when the divorce is all wrapped up, the guy who came into the house or the girl who came into the marriage with that house they had before, they're going to keep that. The divorce court just can't take it from them. Now, let's say it's community property. Can a divorce court order the sale of that community property house? Yes, the divorce court can absolutely divide all the property that's in the community and order the sale of the house if it comes down to that. The best thing to do is for the parties to come to some kind of an agreement on how they're going to divide that piece of property and not put that in the court's hands.
That's interesting because the next question actually talks about that. If they can't come to an agreement, who gets to keep the property?
Well, that's going to be up to the judge to decide if you can't come to an agreement. So what you're going to do is you're going to list all the property that the community owns, and you're going to hand that to the court. You'll both put on some evidence about equities and who should get this and who should get that. But at the end of the day, the judge may hear some of that, may not. The judge is going to go straight down that list of property and divide it the way the judge wants to divide it. And it could be ordering the sale of that house and dividing the residue that comes from it, the receipts.
So when people say, is my partner entitled to half of my house, even if it's in my name, does that just ultimately mean that it's up to the judge?
Yeah, so that's an interesting concept you bring up, in my name. It's possible to buy a house during marriage, which means it's community property, and have it in your own name. So how the house is titled is not as important as when the title was incepted. When did we acquire this house? Did someone acquire the house before marriage, or was it acquired after marriage? And I have a very interesting little sidebar on that. We talked about separate ownership of the house. We talked about community property ownership of the house, right? There's a scenario, and there's actually case law out there, where a couple made agreements before they got married to buy the house. They used joint monies, but it was only under one person's name. And then they got married, and then they kept their agreements going. And the marriage ended in divorce, and the trial court, as a local trial court here in Houston, Texas, found that that was community property, even though it was acquired prior to marriage. And the court divided it, and the appellate court upheld it.
Really?
Yeah.
Now, what was the exception in that scenario?
The exception was that it was pretty obvious that it had happened immediately prior to marriage, with agreements that were to be performed during marriage, and then those agreements were performed.
Yeah.
And the equities of the whole situation made it such that the court could find that it was community property.
Interesting. And so what that tells us is that every scenario comes with its own set of complications and its own different ways to resolve them.
Right, exactly. And to get back to the question you asked, the question was centered around the title being in somebody's name or the other, and that alone is not the dispositive factor that settles the issue. You're going to have to talk to a professional about that.
Yeah, I hear that all the time, actually. That's actually one of the main things, where the spouse, one of the spouses, will be on title and thinking that they have full ownership or the ability to make decisions on behalf of the house, without realizing that they only own, at that point, half of the ownership of that property.
Right, right. And maybe during the marriage, they had agreed on sole management. That's a regime you can agree to during marriage. And that's pretty easy to see, like with checking accounts. You know, you have a job, you put that money in your account that only you access, and your spouse does the same. That's community money. Mm-hmm. But it's sole management of the asset. The property, the family code allows you to manage those assets just as if they were in your own name, in your name only. But when it comes time to divorce, community property rules apply. And even though you had been managing that property yourself, making all the decisions on it, when it comes time for the divorce, you're going to have to cooperate, and you're going to have to come to some agreements or accept what the court tells you to do.
It's interesting because we get this question all the time. Once you're in a divorce, who's going to pay the utility bills? And does one spouse or the other have to pay it until the divorce is over?
So now you're getting into issues of use of the house during the divorce. Who's going to be in the house during the divorce? Who's going to pay for the expenses of the house? And it's not just the utilities people are concerned about. They're concerned about the mortgage, or both mortgages, the taxes, all those issues. Typically, and this is not a rule that's going to apply to every case, but typically the spouse that is in the house getting the use of the house is going to be the one that is going to keep paying for all those expenses. But I mean, there's a lot of cases where, say you had a stay-at-home mom and you've got children of tender ages, and you've got a husband out there who's got a traveling job and he's been away from the house a lot, and he's a very high earner, earning high six figures. There's a lot of cases like that where that stay-at-home mom gets to stay in the house, and that earner, that high wage earner, is going to have to keep paying the bills in that house, even though he's not enjoying the house during the divorce.
Is that something that gets negotiated as part of going through the divorce?
It can be, yes. Usually those issues are settled early on in some kind of a temporary order setting, some kind of an interim order. something early on that's not the final order that the court issues.
Based on that last comment, it brings us to the next question, which I hear this often. Did my spouse abandon me by leaving the house? Have you heard that before?
Oh yeah. And people want to go find things on the internet and use that fact to sway it in their direction.
Mm-hmm.
So first of all, by leaving the house, you don't give up your ownership interest in it, right? I mean, you didn't sign papers. You have to go sign deed work to get a house out of your name. No one can just take a house from you just because you walked out of the house.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So
it's funny because that's not the common understanding. Most people believe that's the case. If you leave, you lose some sort of interest.
Right. No, you lose no interest in it at all. And that divorce court has got a duty to the community to, I don't know that a duty, but a duty to the law to divide it just and right in an equitable fashion. And you're not going to lose that just and right division of what you have an ownership interest in just because you left the house. I mean, there's a lot of untenable situations that happen in divorce. People don't get to that end of their marriage and just get along like they did the first day when they got together.
It's usually the opposite.
Right. Quite often there's a lot of fighting. Could be physical problems. We might have some abusive situations. Maybe you're being the smart, wise spouse by leaving the house to de-escalate the situation. You're certainly not going to lose ownership interest in the house by de-escalating a situation. There's no trial court in Texas that's going to hold you guilty or liable for defusing that family law situation. That judge is going to actually be happy with you if that's the facts and they all come out in court.
Man, that's good to hear. What comes up usually after that question is, well, then is it better to sell the house before or after divorce?
That's a tough one.
What's your opinion on that?
It really is a tough one. I think that if at any time a married couple can agree to do something together to get rid of the assets, hard assets that are difficult to manage together on the other side of divorce, that it's only going to be a good thing if to the point that they can cooperate and work together and get it done. Yeah. So if we're talking and working together and we're not trying to heist the money from the proceeds and we're agreeing how we're going to divvy it up, probably a good thing. But in a very distrustful environment where somebody's likely to try to game it or move the ball in their direction, then it might be better to have that governed by the court.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that on my end, when somebody reaches out and says, Alan, I need to sell my house, I'm going through a divorce, one of the major things that I'm looking into is, what is the situation with the spouse? Are you on talking terms? Is this going to be something that you both can agree on? If so, yes, it's much easier to do it prior to going through the divorce if there's conversation, right? If there's communication, or if both parties have an agreement that they believe is in the best interest of each other to sell now so that they can have access to those funds should there be equity. But in the scenario where one is trying to gain and keep the other one from gaining, yeah, sometimes it's just better to have a court mandated agreement that says this is what's going to happen.
Right, yeah. Exactly.
And the last thing that comes up is, well, if I need to sell my house right now, what are going to be my options to sell? And so we know that there are three options that come up. Robert, let me know if you agree or disagree with any of these. The first one is the buyout. The buyout is one of the simpler options, which is one of the spouses buying out the equity of the other spouse. But the intricacy there is that the spouse that is buying the other spouse out has to qualify to buy out that spouse. So they actually have to go through a pre-approval process to meet with a loan officer to be able to qualify for a refinance of their current mortgage, and then calculate how much is owed to that other spouse, take some of the cash out, and that's what buys that other person out. And once they've decided to do that, you put that in writing, and then I'm in charge of getting them the highest offer for their property so that they can go through that process.
Right.
So that's generally option number one, is the buyout. Unfortunately, not everybody can qualify for that, because usually when people buy a house, they're buying it based on a dual income approval. Right? So they combine their incomes to be able to qualify for that house, meaning that if they don't have those incomes, both incomes, they generally can't qualify for the buyout.
Right.
So it's very rare that we actually see that, but it is an option that exists. The next one is co-ownership. Have you seen co-ownership work?
Rarely. Yeah. If the marriage is so untenable that you can't stay married, it's pretty rare that you're the couple that can also stay in business together.
Yeah.
Usually people are so tired of each other's stuff that they're ready to just be done.
You know, when we see a scenario where there's no equity, when there's not a possibility to potentially sell and be able to cover closing costs, or maybe there's going to be a financial loss, the co-ownership scenario becomes a potential option. But yes, you're absolutely right. It has to be a couple that can somehow still keep cordial communication and know that at that point they're separating, but they're in business together, because that property becomes essentially a tenant dwelling. They become landlords for in most cases.
Right. And that's something I don't think enough people give weight to when they're contemplating keeping an asset on the other side of a divorce, is that you're in business together. Don't look at it as some domestic purchase or, some nice little fun thing. This is a business. Just like if you were to come and, come meet Alan and say, Alan, let's go invest in this house together. It's the same level of involvement if it's going to work.
Absolutely. In fact, we've only had one case where they decided co-ownership was the right way to go. And what ended up happening is they decided to move the property into an LLC that they both co-own. It really was just a business set up just to have that property be leased out, and it worked out for them. That was their specific scenario.
Yeah.
Last but not least, the final option is to simply sell the property, which is something that we do, and we provide two options for that. There's the option to sell the property as is, where is, to the highest cash offer bidder, or the option to list it on MLS, on the market, and go through the normal process of selling, which is people coming into the house, looking at it, making their offers, and going through the negotiation process to finally get to the point where we can get to the sale. Now, both of those come with their own set of intricacies, and they come with their own set of challenges. The biggest challenge is who's living in the house. Are they going to be able to allow people in? Is the house in good enough condition for other people to purchase it, or does it need repairs? And those are all the things that we're looking for and that we're advising on and that we're providing solutions for, to be able to make their process easier when it comes to getting that property sold.
Right.
Now, on your end, do you have challenges for the real estate that you see people come up with?
You just brought up a question that I get a lot that I think should be pointed your direction.
Sure.
And so let's talk about those houses that need repairs. Everybody knows that if you're going to put your house for sale, it's going to need A, B, or C, carpet, paint, whatever.
Yeah. Who
is that decision best made by? Do homeowners generally make good assumptions about that, or should they talk to a professional about it?
It's when you're in a divorce, it's a very emotional state of mind. And so what we find is that most homeowners tend to make irrational emotional decisions on what repairs can be done, should be done, and who is going to do them. The biggest challenge that I see is homeowners in a divorce case thinking, I know my house needs to be painted to get the highest price on the market. I'm going to go in there and paint it myself. And of course, they've never painted a house before, and it's not going to look professionally done. And most of the time, it actually hurts their value to go in there and do any repairs themselves than actually bringing in additional value. The right answer to your question is it should be done by a professional. It should, and so the way that we're structured is we give people options. Here's what you can get for your property if you do absolutely nothing to it. Here's the price range we believe you're going to get based on bringing you multiple cash buyers to bid against each other. Here's what you can get if you do these couple of things, just to make sure that it's spiffy and nice for people to walk through. And if you want to hit the absolute top line of the market, here are the things that you need to do for it, and here's a potential estimate of what you're going to spend. Now, what we find is most people aren't looking to spend a ton of money on fixing up their house as they're going through a divorce. That's the last thing people want to do, is take on this huge project. But the reason we provide that is because we want people to understand what their options are and make a decision that suits them in their scenario. If they come to me and say, Alan, I don't want to spend more time, money, and effort on this. I don't have the time or the budget for it. Then now they know that they can choose to sell the property as is, which is normally what most people do if there's enough equity, because that's the other factor is, do they have enough equity, and is the property in financeable condition, right? Now the equity is an important factor, but if it's not in financeable condition, sometimes they have to sell it as is, because otherwise no one else is going to buy it.
Right. You bring up an interesting point that we see in our office quite a bit, and that's people coming in with these divorce questions, and we start trying to talk about the equity, and they honestly don't know any of their numbers. Yeah. And that's one thing I urge you to do before you reach out to any of us professionals is know your numbers. Go look and see what the payoff is on the mortgage. Mm-hmm. Do some kind of a survey to get a ballpark idea of what your house would sell for if you were to try to sell it today. And that just kind of give you a range and idea to know if the houses in your market are selling for $400,000 for a house like that, you got a $500,000 mortgage, you got a problem.
Absolutely. And it's a much different conversation when you have equity versus when you don't have equity. Right. Or when you have a ton of repairs to do and you're not in a financeable property versus in a property that is tip top, ready to go, ready to sell. There's a lot of scenarios there that the right advice can point you in the right direction.
Right.
With that said, unfortunately, we've run out of time. We promised everyone that we were going to bring them information based on how they could go through this process and be equipped with the right information to make a educated decision. I hope we've been able to bring that to you. As promised, for those of you guys that take the next 5 minutes to register to speak to either one of us, so Robert or myself, about your specific scenario, then we're going to send you guys a copy of our book. If you've listened all the way to the end, by now you would have known if you can be forced to sell your house, who gets to keep the house, what happens when you move out, who is entitled and who's not entitled, who has to pay the bills, what happens on abandonment, and by the way, how long does a divorce take in Texas, as a final question?
All right, the shortest that it can take by law is 60 days from the day you file till the day the judge has the power to grant the divorce. If you're trying to sell real estate or you have other complicated assets to divide, you're looking at probably double that, maybe triple that. So you're looking at 4 to 6 months. And that's on a short end if everybody more or less agrees and doesn't fight over a whole lot.
Got it.
If we're going to argue and fight and go get in front of the judge and have to go get experts involved, that time's just going to multiply.
Yeah. And of course, that multiplies cost.
Absolutely.
Fantastic.
Absolutely.
Robert, thank you so much for being on with us today. We appreciate your time.
Pleasure.
Guys, for those of you that are needing to understand more about your specific scenario, we're going to add our information. We're going to give you guys all of the info that you need in this book, as well as a follow-up. And if you send us your contact information, we'll be in contact with you with any additional questions you may have. Thank you guys once again for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Take care.